We got some time to go, but let's talk about why with EJ Antoni, economist at the Heritage Foundation, and, of course, in-house economist of the Vince Coglianese Show. I'm Pete Mundo, host mornings on KCMO in Kansas City, filling in for Vince today. And according to all the news reports, even those outlets that don't really like President-elect Donald Trump, they have overwhelmingly suggested that the market bump today, which right now the Dow's sitting at about up 400 points, is in part because of Donald Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary. That is Scott Bessent. So, EJ, good afternoon. It's great to have you here. Let me ask you first about Scott Bessent and why you think Donald Trump ended up picking him for the job.
Oh, Pete, great to be with you. Scott has an absolutely tremendous financial background. He's not an economist. He's actually an economic historian, but he's run his own hedge fund for quite a while. He has worked for other hedge funds as well. People don't realize he was actually the one behind the trade years ago that broke the Bank of England. We're talking about $1 billion international bet, and he was spot on. Speaking of times when he was spot on, earlier this year, Pete, in a letter, I think it was a letter to his investors that somehow got leaked, he talked about how what we're seeing in markets this year, the rally, is part of a Trump trade, he called it, where whenever Trump was ahead in the polls, essentially markets were doing 10 times better than when one of his rivals, either Biden or Harris, was ahead in the polls. And since he thought Trump was going to win, he said any pullback should be bought, and you should expect that, again, as Trump is ahead in the polls, you're going to see better returns in the market. Sure enough, Trump wins, and the Dow jumps 1,300 points in a single day. So he really has a tremendous sense of financial markets and sovereign debt markets specifically. And here's part of the reason why equities are rallying. Everyone knows that Yellen is leaving the Treasury in an absolute mess, and it's going to take a mastermind, I think, like Bessent, to really clean things up. So cometh the hour, cometh the man.
So when you say clean things up with the Treasury, what does that entail, and what can he start doing the second he gets confirmed to clean up the Treasury, as you put it?
Well, as the Treasury Secretary, he's going to be in charge of a lot of aspects of implementing Trump's economic policies. He's going to have a heavy hand in things like adjusting taxes, whether that's domestic taxes like the income tax or foreign taxes like tariffs. That's not to say that he's necessarily writing the legislation, but he's certainly going to have a hand in the entire process of both crafting these policies and then also implementing them. So there's that whole aspect there. But we also have to remember that Yellen has been messing around like crazy with Treasury markets. One of the things she's been doing is she's been borrowing less on long-term, like 30-year bonds, and relying very heavily on Treasury bills. Those are essentially debt securities that have at most a one-year maturity, but a lot of them are much shorter. And by leaning on the short end of the yield curve, as we call it, Yellen has basically been changing which security interest rates are going up or down. So she's trying to have less of an impact on market interest rates like a 30-year mortgage or the 10-year note. The problem is that this has proved to be extremely expensive. She's basically increased interest on the debt by about $100 billion a year. And on top of that, it means that as you unwind this whole thing, in other words, as we return to basically normal operations, it's going to suck about $1 trillion of liquidity out of the marketplace. So it's going to have a tremendous negative impact on financial markets. And again, that's why I say it's going to take a financial mastermind, I think, like Mr. Bessent, to really manage that properly without having severe negative impacts.
So if I'm hearing this right, EJ Antoni, what you're saying then is that she has basically done what she's had to do in the short term, that being Janet Yellen, to prop up the market at potentially major long-term negative ramifications to our deficit. Is that basically the trick that she has been playing?
I would actually add to that. You're absolutely right, Pete. It's had tremendous negative impacts in terms of the deficit. It's basically added about 10% to the annual deficit. But on top of that, not only does it have a severe long-term negative impact there, she could have locked in, for example, at near zero interest rates, very long-term debt issuance and save the taxpayer a lot of money, but it's also going to have very negative effects on the real economy. What she's basically been doing is try to juice the economy at the same time Jerome Powell at the Fed has been trying to put the brakes on. So you have one stomping on the gas, one stomping on the brake. At the same time, Powell took about $1 trillion of liquidity out of the system. She put about $1 trillion of liquidity in. And so that's a big reason why inflation still isn't dead, why it's still such a problem in the economy, why these high prices and fast price increases just aren't going away.
So you tell me, EJ Antoni, with the, of course, he's the economist here for the Vince Coglianese Show, joining us on KCMO with the Heritage Foundation. CNBC wrote this, and they wrote favorably about Bessent, which tells you a lot. I mean, they're certainly not going to be fans of President Trump, but they write here that Bessent favors a three-pronged approach that addresses worries over the ballooning national debt and deficits, growing the economy at a 3% rate, knocking down the budget deficit to 3% of GDP. That's about half of where it is now, and ending 3 million barrels a day in oil production. How realistic is that, and can that be enough to get the job done?
Well, let's start with the last one there in terms of oil production, and really I'll throw natural gas production in there as well. You know, we can get a lot more barrels of oil and many more pounds of natural gas out of this economy, out of our natural resources, despite the fact that production has in fact gone up under the Biden administration. It could be much higher because even as production has been going up, well count has actually been going down. The reason for that is the increased taxes and regulation have made it so that only the most profitable wells right now can stay in production. But if you get rid of the taxes that were put in place by things like the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, if you can roll back a lot of the excessive and burdensome regulation, then all of a sudden a well, which today is only profitable at $80 or $90 a barrel, becomes profitable at $40 or $50 a barrel once again. So you will open up wells that already exist. You can actually get energy prices down and get energy production up very quickly because a lot of that infrastructure is already in place. And now, in terms of the other 2 points, again, you reduce taxes and you reduce regulation. 3% growth is perfectly achievable. And in terms of getting the deficit down, that means you got to get spending down, and you can do that. I'm extremely hopeful about this new Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. I think we have a very good chance for the first time in my lifetime of actual deep spending cuts through real spending reform.
What does it say about Scott Bessent, who has a long history of supporting Democratic causes before he backed Trump in 2016? What does it say that Donald Trump continues to surround himself, in many cases, with people who used to be Democrats, whether it's Tulsi Gabbard, whether it's RFK Jr., whether it's, Elon Musk? You mentioned Doge right there. Is that anything that people should be concerned about when they look at Scott Bessent as the potential next Treasury Secretary?
You know what? I would not be concerned because a lot of Trump's voters aren't concerned because it's emblematic of a lot of Trump's voters. Let's not forget, this man has built a new coalition that has a very large component of former Democrats. You know, Bessent was one of the people who initially was not a believer in Trumponomics, if you want to call it that, right? This president's economic plan. But he was humble enough to see the first go around how Trump's policies actually did achieve the things which for the president initially set out to do. And a lot of people, I think, fall into that camp. I talked to a lot of economists, for example, who their entire lives were essentially, you could call them free traders, where they had this blind adherence to this idea that we shouldn't have any tariffs on anything. And Trump has taught a lot of people, look, tariffs are no different than other kinds of taxes. If you're going to be free trade and you want no taxes on international trade, why do we have taxes on domestic trade? Why do we have an income tax or a sales tax, for example? These things are really fundamentally the exact same thing. So why not tax everything at exactly the same rate, whether it's domestic trade or international trade? That's just one example, I think, of how Trump has brought a lot of people around to seeing economic reality as opposed to just rhetoric.
So how do you guys then, EJ, at the Heritage Foundation, square this potential use of tariffs? I mean, we all know that if you implement tariffs across the board, you will see an increase in prices. But like you said, is it a negotiating ploy, a negotiating tactic? Like, how do we fit, you're right, Donald Trump's use of tariffs into the broader picture and hoping that it's really about just getting as much business back to the United States as possible?
Well, we have to remember that just because you put these tariffs in place, that does not mean that all of these costs are actually going to get passed on to the American consumer. This is one of the things we saw in the first Trump administration, where about 81 cents on the dollar of the tariffs that we put in place, let's say on Chinese goods, for example, about 81 cents on the dollar was actually just eaten by the Chinese manufacturer. In other words, they paid for that, and about 19 cents or so on the dollar was actually passed on to the American consumer in the form of higher prices. Some of that was because the American consumer a lot of times has alternatives. Instead of buying the Chinese steel, for example, they could buy domestic steel. They could buy steel from Sweden or other countries. And so these Chinese manufacturers are having to balance how much do we want to pass on to the American consumer. Now, in terms of, is this a negotiating tactic? Is it a revenue measure? Sometimes it's both. And we've seen that where the president has threatened with using the power of the American consumer. He has said, unless you open up your markets to us, we're effectively going to close markets to you. And we're going to do that through these tariffs. We're going to put punitively high tariffs in place. But, again, we have to go back to this idea that tariffs are not somehow going to crash the economy. They didn't the first time around. They would not again. And let's not forget the most prosperous time in our nation's history where we actually built the middle class, where we had the fastest growth, was a period when the government relied exclusively on tariffs. We didn't even have an income tax. It was America's golden age or gilded age after the Civil War and before the implementation of the Fed and of the income tax in 1913.
All right, EJ, I do have to ask you about Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary pick of Donald Trump. People have brought up, of course, his couple of decades as a top executive at George Soros' investment fund. Clearly no concerns there for Donald Trump. What do you know about that background and why it doesn't worry you?
Well, it doesn't worry me for a couple of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that a lot of Bessent's time working with Soros predates when Soros really went off the deep end and got into all these crazy left-wing causes. Another reason it doesn't really bother me is the fact that, look, money is fundamentally agnostic. If you own a business, you don't really care if your customer is a Democrat or Republican. Their money is worth exactly the same. And on top of that, another key thing is going back to this idea that Bessent has, I think, really changed his mind in terms of how Trump's economic policies really do work. By seeing these policies implemented and seeing their effects, I think it really has not only Bessent, but changed a lot of people's minds and converted a lot of folks.
Very well said. Very well done. EJ Antoni, Heritage Foundation, of course, the Economist here with the Vince Coglianese Show. We appreciate it as always, EJ. Great insight. Thanks so much, my man.